what are the expectations for this team? It seems like this is a greater scenario like we saw with Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce and how, Boston gave up a lot for those guys. And, you saw, they gave those two guys up. They got a lot of picks. They rebuilt. And Brooklyn, they sacrificed a lot for a long time. And it just seems like they have to win the title now or else this team's a failure. So do you see that? I mean, Greg alluded to if they played LA, the Lakers, in the finals and get bounced, is that going to be good enough considering these three guys? Or are they going to get a little bit of a pass because of COVID? I mean, is that going to play a factor into it where they might get a little bit of leniency because of these circumstances, because of COVID protocols, maybe another bubble situation, maybe not? Like, how much leniency do you think this team would get because of this time that we're in compared to if times were normal, there'd be no excuses? But considering what the players have gone through, as we outlined in our last show, do you think the Nets might be cut a break from a media perspective in terms of their expectations if they don't win the title, just considering what COVID has brung? Even, with Kyrie Irving, with this through, maybe the pandemic is affecting him more than most. We just don't know, right? So do you think they might get a little bit of a pass with the expectations of this season, or do you think it's championship or bust and then they'll be seen as a colossal failure if they don't win it all this year?
Championship or bust at the moment. I think overall the media, this is a different topic, so I won't stay long here, but I think overall the media is actually really pretty nice and understanding to the players these days. I mean, the media oftentimes seems like fans, like you and I are definitely hardcore NBA fans. That's why we do this podcast. Seems like a lot of times the media, not to compare myself to them and someone with a journalism degree, but it does seem like in order to acquire contacts with these players, be close with these players, you're often pretty kind to these players. And, that can lead. We've seen plenty of soft questions in post-game interviews and things like that. But I do think the Nets, by their actions in this trade and by selling away their future with all those first-round picks that are either swaps or just traded away outright, I mean, they really have made it about, this is about the next 3 seasons. If this team doesn't implode and come apart before that time, that's really the window we're looking at, to where, if they don't get past the Bucks, which, by the way, I think the Bucks are a much better constructed team at this point than the Nets. I know we have a lot of star power on this Nets team. We have a lot of offense, but I think the Bucks are better equipped to handle this team, to spread the ball in a way that they're used to, and to defend those star players from the Nets. So it wouldn't shock me at all if the Bucks were able to beat the Nets. If the Heat can get things together, it wouldn't shock me if they were able to give the Nets a run for their money. So I think the pressure is going to be very, very high. And if there is a tough media area on players, we know that, at least traditionally in the past, it's been in New York. So can they handle that pressure cooker that is the New York sports media? All stuff that you and I have said plenty of times in our friends chat.
That's true.
We're looking forward to seeing the show unfold. I do think, they have to be at least a top 3 favorite in the East, if not the outright favorite, just by the names that are on the roster. But I don't see anyone on this roster who's going to play defense. And we touched on that a little bit in the interview with Greg. But I don't know. Do you think that that the media is going to be more or less merciful than I described there?
Depends on who you talk to. Mainstream media, so like your ESPN's talking heads, harsh. The spotlight's going to be hot. So I think they're going to be overly critical of this team. I think journalists that are close, they're going to be more trying to understand what is the mindset of all 3 of these guys, because it's a very volatile situation. And I agree with you to some point. I mean, we've seen journalists it kind of just depends on the journalist, right? Because there's somebody like a Jackie McMullen who's a veteran of these locker rooms, and yet she's been on record of having a contentious relationship with some of these players, even though, they have volatile personalities themselves. But at the same time, you have younger journalists that are able to relate to these players a lot more. I bring up like a Malika Andrews, for instance. I think with her, she's able to connect with the players more because she's of a younger demographic. So she's maybe able to get more insight and ask maybe harsher questions, and it comes from a good place rather than a Jackie McMullen that she may not be able to relate to that generation. So I think it's going to be fairly interesting to see moving forward as we get more younger journalists and the writers that we've talked to. They're on the younger side. I mean, we haven't talked to I think maybe Ali Kosel. Maybe it was somebody that a little bit on the older side of things. No disrespect, I'm not saying he's old, but just in terms of kind of leaning into our generation. I mean, the people that we talked to, they're all around our age or younger. So the way you can relate to somebody, even if they're asking a harsher question, it might be different per se, even though you're on the media side. To your defensive standpoint, I think you're right. We've talked about this with Greg, so we don't spend too much time. This team's not going to play any defense. And I think even a team like Miami, and I forgive me, I don't know what their record is now, but if they're going to be in the
4-7.
Okay, so let's just say they turn
Slow
it around.
start.
Yeah, and they've been hit with COVID as well from what
and injuries.
Yeah, so let's say they're able to, get like 7, 8 seed. They're going to be a highly dangerous team. And even if they get into the play-in tournament, I don't know how it's going to factor in, but hypothetical situation, if they're, if just depending on the circumstances, let's say Brooklyn is 1-3 and Miami is 6-8, they end up playing each other. I mean, that is a highly dangerous game for the Brooklyn Nets. I mean, I would not want to see Miami. I'd rather play in Milwaukee, to be honest.
Just Spoelstra versus Coach Nash.
Yeah, and that's a good point. We saw that with just even last year with Budenholzer and with Spoelstra, and Spoelstra's under Pat Riley. I mean, you can see the connection there. Spoelstra's not just his success is not a fluke. He knows what he's doing in there. And seeing somebody like a Steve Nash, where everybody's like, yeah, he's a first-year player and everything, like strategy, it does play a lot. Adjustments, especially in the playoffs, is critical compared to a regular season game, which guys can flow. And I think coaching is less of a factor per se in the regular season, but in the playoffs, it's vital. And you're right. That's an excellent point where you're going to have guys that have never only played with each other for a certain amount of time, facing a defensive locked team and a team with lots of confidence like Miami, in which they don't care what seed they are. It doesn't really matter. There's no fans. Even if there's not going to be a bubble, there's not going to be that home court advantage. It's going to be irrelevant. I mean, they're a highly dangerous team. So I could easily see Brooklyn getting bounced in the second round or even in the first round if they play Miami. And that's my danger of them, from a defensive standpoint. I don't know. If I'm a Brooklyn fan, I'm very nervous. I mean, I kind of like it. If I'm, you're getting all these star players at the same time in terms of continuity, in terms of meshing, I don't like their future moving forward. And I want to pass you this question from a Kevin Durant standpoint. How do you think he'll react to this in terms of one, Kyrie not just being on the team, and then two, again, he left Golden State because it was Steph Curry's team, and also with shots too, right? You had Klay Thompson, he needed his shots. You needed Steph Curry, he needed his shots. Everybody had to sacrifice in this situation. I'm sure in his mind, even though I heard reports that he wanted James Harden. How do you think he's going to really adjust to this? Because he's basically in the same situation he was before in Golden State. So I don't know how it's going to play out any differently. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if this team's going to be successful, KD is the rock of this team. KD is the foundation of this team. And I think that does hold true. I do expect him to be that. He's shown, like in Golden State, that he can collaborate. He can work with other players. He doesn't care about taking a ton of shots. He really, I believe, sincerely just cares about getting the win. So I expect that to continue. I'm just worried about Harden, and I'm worried about Kyrie. I think Harden coming in, obviously there's motivations there that just from getting traded. He wants to prove himself. He wants to show himself off and contend for that title now, since he hasn't done that yet. So I think there's clear incentives for Harden. We already touched on Kyrie a ton. I mean, that's really the big question mark on this team, if you're asking me. But I think KD is going to be the top dog and the leader of this team just fine. So I don't have any doubts as far as it goes on his end of things.